today we are going to talk about Plotinus. So Plotinus is generally considered the father of Neoplatonism. And I know in the last session, we did some very kind of quick overview of some of the basic philosophy and philosophical concepts that are in Neoplatonism. A lot of these are going to be rooted in Plotinus, and so we're going to go into them in some more depth here today. So my learning objectives for this particular session is I am hoping by the end of it, you will have a good understanding of the place of Plotinus within Platonic tradition and have a pretty solid understanding of his basic theories. Because what I'm hoping you will be able to do is that if you decide to go read the Enneads, you will have a good chance of understanding them more clearly. And also, because of the nature of this group and the Theosophical Society and the fact that we are looking at this from an esoteric lens, I wanted to do some basic exposure to his methods of contemplation as practice. So some of the basic facts around Plotinus: he was born 203, 204 CE, and he died in 270. And as I said, he is considered the founder of Neoplatonism. He is also recognized as one of the world's great mystics, which I had mentioned in the last session. And that's how I first encountered him, is through some studies in comparative mysticism. He mostly taught in lecture style, and he really only has the one written work, which is the Enneads. And the Enneads have there's six of them, and they have 9 tractates. Ennead means 9. So there are these kind of 6 organized larger categories, each of which has 9 tractates inside. Now, these were lightly edited and put in order by Porphyry. And the editing is important because one of the things to note is that Plotinus himself both had really bad eyesight and just absolutely terrible handwriting, apparently. And he did not edit himself. As I said, he was mostly known for being an oral teacher. And so what would happen is he would begin writing and he would just write until he was done, and that would be the end of it. So those of us who know anything about the way in which the Secret Doctrine was composed, there's something kind of interesting there also, in that you have this brilliant man who actually had to be put in order and arranged by an editor, much like Blavatsky did for the Secret Doctrine. And some of the difficulties sometimes in understanding pieces of the Ennead are probably because there was not, he was not primarily a writer. So his biography, we have the source for this is Porphyry, who is his main kind of student. And he was born in Egypt, in Roman Egypt, in 203 or 4 CE. And he, early on in his life, attended philosophical lectures in Alexandria, which, of course, founded by Alexander the Great to be a center of learning. We all know about the library that was founded there, and the museum is what it would be called, because it's of the muses. This area that's almost like a university was very, very important in Alexandria. At about the age of 28, he met Ammonius Saccas, who I had mentioned in the last class. And Ammonius Saccas, again, we know that he had this belief that philosophy should be treated like a mystery and it should not be written down. So it's only at the end of Plotinus's life that he decides to write things down, and that it should be held within the close confines of the students. So he met Ammonius Saccas and he studied with him for about 16 years. At the end of 16 years, Plotinus went on a Persian campaign with the Emperor Gordian, because what he wanted to do was to get a better understanding of Persian philosophy. But on his way in this campaign, the Emperor Gordian was assassinated, and that ended that particular piece of his adventure. So at the age of 40, then, Plotinus went to Rome and opened a school. He opened a philosophical school. And when Plotinus was 60, Porphyry of Tyre, the person who became his main disciple in terms of the importance as a philosopher later, joined the school of Plotinus. So Plotinus, as I mentioned, his strength was as an oral teacher, and he was apparently brilliant at having these kind of interactive lectures. But the written works are not his strength. There's some real beauty in them. I hope that you all got the PDF with some of them. I'm going to be using some of the quotes to kind of flesh out some of the points that I'll be making. But his written works apparently do not do real justice to the brilliance of his oral teaching. But he did also serve as a spiritual director or counselor in Rome for many, many people. So he had his like accepted students, but in addition to that, he was recognized in the community and served a broader community. And he was considered to be an exemplar of what it means to live a philosophical life, to live as a lover of wisdom, which of course is what philosophy means. He had a strong focus on the transcendent and humility. And for instance, it was very common in various Platonic schools to have a birthday feast upon the death of the teacher, and to kind of add them to the birthday feast is a way of kind of doing almost some ancestor veneration of a sort. So these would be like the philosophical ancestors of a Platonic school. And he didn't tell anyone what his birthday is, which is why we have that kind of like he's roughly it's 2003, 2004, because he didn't want a birthday feast. He didn't want to be held up in that way. And similarly, it was very common to have a statue that would be made of the leader of a school when they would die, and then that would be part of kind of the ancestor veneration when we're talking about the heroes of the school. And he did not want that either. And he said, why would I consent to have an image of an image made? Because of course, the body is an image of the immortal aspect of self. And he's saying, why would I want an image of an image to survive me? So as I mentioned, Ammonius Saccas believed philosophical teaching should be held in secrecy among the students, like the mysteries were, the mystery religions. And Plotinus was only oral. He only taught orally for a very long time. When he wrote his tractates, he used them with his senior students, but he only shared them with his senior students. And it was upon his death that Porphyry then edited them and arranged them into the Enneads. He was known for having very deep intuitive wisdom and sensitivity. And one of the stories that's very touching is that there was apparently Porphyry, it's well documented, and he documents it himself, was prone to what we would now call clinical depression. And there was a time in which he was in the throes of clinical depression and was committing suicide, and he was not present, but Plotinus sensed this and went to him and intervened and sent him on a type of pilgrimage, which Porphyry attributes to saving his life. He was also entrusted by the people in his community to look after orphaned children as guardians. He was named as the guardian, where if there was an orphan child that had money associated from the family, he would be the one that would be taking care of the children and helping them through that period until they were of an age that they could inherit. That was apparently not an uncommon thing for Plotinus. Like he had quite a number of people that he was doing this kind of service for. It was unusual to ask someone who was not like the bosom family friend, but he was again recognized as having this tremendous both wisdom and kindness, and also honesty. At age 66, when he fell ill, he refused all medicine but massage, and his death words were, "I have been a long time waiting for you. I am striving to give back the divine in myself to the divine in all." And after his death, the Delphic oracle, so Apollon, the god Apollon, Apollo, through the Delphic oracle, placed his soul along with Plato and Pythagoras as advanced beings who are in communion directly with the gods. So we know from his writing and from the testimony of Porphyry that Plotinus experienced mystical ecstasies. And as I said, he is recognized as one of the world's great mystics. And this is unitive mysticism. And he wrote about some of them, and in the biography, Porphyry, who had been present when he would be swept into this ecstatic mystical rapture, experienced it. So he had a reputation for these kinds of ecstasies. So ecstasy is a Greek word, it's ekstasis, and it means to stand outside oneself. So you stand outside yourself. It's actually commonly used in the Dionysiac mysteries. Ekstasis, you stand outside yourself, and then enthusiasmos, where you are filled, or entheos, where you're filled with the divine. In this case, what we are looking at is a description of unitive mysticism, and that is what he describes. So I'm going to read here, and I've given it in your handout. It has happened often, roused into myself from my body. Outside everything else and inside myself, my gaze has met a beauty wondrous and great. At such moments, I have been certain that mine was the better part, mine the best of lives lived to the fullest, mine identity with the divine. Fixed there firmly, poised above everything in the intellectual that is less than the highest, utter actuality was mine. So this is a very strong kind of testament to something that we recognize in the study of comparative mysticism as being a kind of experience that occurs across time and across all cultures and traditions. And so he has moved and shifted so that he is no longer experiencing from within the body, and that it has this kind of blissful everything that is wonderful and great, and this identity, this full identity with the divine. So the lack of subject-object differentiation, and it is above anything that we would recognize as intellectual, because the unitive mystical experience does not have content other than this experience of ultimate unity and bliss. Another, the soul reaching towards the formless finds itself incompetent to grasp where nothing bounds it, or to take the impression where the impinging reality is diffuse. In sheer dread of holding to nothingness, it slips away. The state is painful. Often it seeks relief by retreating from all this vagueness to the region of sense, there to rest on solid ground. And again, this is interesting in that the unitive experience itself, it tends to be very blissful, but there are moments in which, especially when you have not, when it's early on, they talk about the dark night of the soul kind of thing. This is partially what they're talking about here, is this feeling that's almost like the void, and it can slip away. So if that moment is approaching and you are having this kind of into the void moment and it is too uncomfortable, that is when the mind, it tends to retreat back to the realm of sense. So I wanted to share that as a couple of the statements that are indicative of some of the unitive mysticism. So I'll go through all of these in more detail in a minute, but I just wanted, for the sake of getting everything out here, the key contributions that Plotinus makes. He talks about philosophy as a mystery religion, which we'll go into. We'll go into all of these. Unity within a mystical frame, the theory of emanation. It kind of comes out of Plotinus. The three hypostases, the problem of evil, recognition of multiple paths for different personalities, and then the idea of reascent through contemplation. So that is kind of the list of the major things that I see that Plotinus contributes. And so we'll go into each one in turn. So the mysteries, the mystery religions, is a very specific, originally ancient Greek, so Hellenic form. It then carries into, once you have Hellenism, it carries into the various areas in the Hellenistic, the areas that were brought together under Alexander the Great, and then after that, in that great cultural mashup, and then that translates into Rome. So there are a number of characteristics of mystery religions, which, like I said, is this very specific kind of form. They are about transformation, individual transformation through ritual. So they are meant to be personal. So they are impacting the individual initiates. And this is quite different than many of the kind of civic cults that are really more about how to do things for the community, how to ensure that the community or the family or whatever the larger collective is in good relationship with the gods. That's not what the mystery religions are. The mystery religions are about individual transformation, and they are therefore not something that everyone does. They are optional, and often you have to prove yourself in some way as being worthy of them. These initiations, because that's what a mystery religion is, it's about the initiation. These are the specific rites that cause some sort of transformation that is at the level of being that is immortal. And I think that's very important. So this transformation is not something, unlike other kinds of initiation, like coming of age initiation. These are happening at the level of being that is immortal. And they are surrounded by secrecy. That is something that is essential to the mysteries. And they alter something in that immortal part of being that specifically offsets some burden of mortality. That is what they're really about. And it does this through divine intimacy, typically with whatever the God or the great one is associated with a particular mystery religion. So what he's saying here is that philosophy is that it is creating this kind of change at the immortal level of being. It is something that is individual. It is something you have to strive for. Not everyone is accepted, is able to achieve the mysteries. But if you can, the God here is the God that is ultimately the one. It is the unitive source of all being. And so it is through that divine intimacy with that which is everything and is the source of everything, that causes a fundamental transformation at the level of self that is immortal. And so throughout Plotinus, and it's already there somewhat in Plato, so he's not coming at this completely alone, but throughout it, he is using mystery language. And so ever after Plotinus, philosophy in these systems, the Neoplatonic systems, takes on a definitively religious character. And a couple of examples is that there is a time in which Porphyry, his student, was delivering a lecture, and his comment was, "You have shown yourself simultaneously to be poet, philosopher, and hierophant." And the hierophant is the high priest of the mysteries. The hierophant is the one who reveals the sacred. He is the shower of the sacred things. And that's from the Eleusinian mysteries, which is the oldest and original source of all mystery religions. Another example I have given you here. This is the purport of that rule of our mysteries: nothing divulged to the uninitiate. Again, that's the vow of secrecy that is in all of the mystery religions. The supreme is not to be made a common story. The holy things may not be uncovered to the stranger, to any that has not himself attained to see. There were not two. Beholder was one with beheld. Again, that's that unitive mystical experience. It was not a vision compassed, but a unity apprehended. The man formed by this mingling with the supreme must, if he only remember, carry its image impressed upon him. So this experience, this unitive experience, it is impressing it upon the very essential nature of one's being, which is immortal. He has become the unity, nothing within him or without inducing any diversity. No movement now, no passion, no outlooking desire. Once this ascent is achieved, reasoning is in abeyance, and all intellection, and even to dare the word, the very self, caught away, filled with God. He has in perfect stillness attained isolation. All that being calmed, he turns neither to this side nor to that, nor even inwards to himself. Utterly resting, he has become very rest. And so all of this, again, in a unitive mystical experience, you have the lack of subject-object differentiation, you have no movement, you have this experience of ultimate unity with no attributes. He belongs no longer to the order of the beautiful. He has risen beyond beauty. He has overpassed even the choir of virtues. He is like one who, having penetrated the inner sanctuary, that is mystery language there, leaves the temple behind him, though these become once more first objects of regard when he leaves the holies. For there his converse was not with image, not with trace, but with the very truth, in the view of which all the rest is but of secondary concern. There indeed it was scarcely vision and less of a mode unknown. It was a going forth from the self, a simplifying, a renunciation, a reach towards contact, and at the same time a repose, a meditation towards adjustment. This is the only seeing of what lies within the holies. To look otherwise is to fail. So this to me is one of the most powerful statements, both of unitive mysticism and, as I said, he's using very, very strong mystery language with everything that that is trying to convey about this fundamental transformation of the soul. And also, I think it's important that the reason that you don't divulge the mysteries is to cheapen them, and that people then believe that they have had an initiation when they have not, and they stop striving. I think that's part of what's going on there. So I wanted to share that because I think it's incredibly powerful and elucidates this point. So now let's go into some basic Platonian metaphysics. I'm going to give you, though, first some pro tips for reading Plotinus. And in case this inspires you to go try to read them, and I do encourage that, I do want to give you some hints because sometimes it can be difficult to read. So the first one is that, just to know, these were tractates that were circulated amongst his senior students, and therefore they are written for advanced students who have all studied all of the existing corpus of Plato and know it very, very well. So part of what's happening when you go in and you're reading these tractates, which, as I said, were not created in a particular order, they were created independently and put into some order, you're stepping into a conversation in media res. So you're just right in the middle. And just to know that and accept it and roll with it, because that's the way it goes. So I also recommend, and part of why I'm trying to kind of do this talk is to give you some background so that you have major outlines of the major theories at hand. If you can know some of the major points and have them at hand, that will just make it easier since you are stepping straight into the conversation. Many of them are structured as arguments, and a lot of the Neoplatonic philosophers like to make arguments in a specific way that can be a little confusing, including, to me, I've read it numerous times, but still, when I'm in the middle of it, they begin with what everyone else thinks first. So you're reading along and they're making a point. It's like, this is the way this is going. You're like, okay, I got it. And then they say, but no, after they state the theory, and then they tell you why they don't agree with that. It's like, oh, okay. And then they'll do that sometimes 3 or 4 times. It's like, here's the next person, and they state their theory, and you're like, okay, I got the theory, but no. And then only at the end of the section do you get to the point where Plotinus is making the argument for what he is trying to set across. So that is just something to know. And I find when I'm reading one of the tractates, it is useful to read it once so you kind of know, like, okay, by the end of it, these 4 things that I'm now going to get, these are the things he doesn't believe, and then go back and read it again when you're not trying to decipher that. So those are just my pro tips for trying to read Plotinus. So let's start with the first kind of main point. And some of this I talked about some last week, but again, that was a brief overview, and I want to go into it in more depth here. So the first thing that is essential for Plotinus and his philosophy is that the idea of the one, the unity that is ultimately transcendent. And the word that is sometimes used for this in Plotinus, we will recognize from Theosophy is the monad. Monad just means one. And it is sometimes discussed as being the good, being beauty, the divine, but it can't properly actually have any adjectives. So it's the one that is not really one, but is beyond one. It's this kind of thing. And you always see this in mystical writings, because what they're talking about is something that transcends all adjectives, all differentiation, all kind of characteristics. And that makes it very difficult to talk about. In the Hindu terminology, they would say nirguna Brahman, so Brahman without attributes. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. So it is beyond being and non-being. And this is not just logical speculation, as we have just explored. This is about mystical experience and the apprehension that comes from mystical experience, this experience of the unity, which once you have experienced it, everything else is less real in your experience than that. It is the most essentially real thing that if you've had a mystical experience that you will ever experience. So it is unity untouched by multiplicity, and therefore it must lack self-knowledge, because the moment you have self-knowledge, then you have subject-object differentiation. And I'm asking you to put a pin in this and be thinking about it, because this is actually very important when we get to the point of reascent through contemplation and the kind of meditation and contemplation that we're doing. What you're trying to do is to get to a point where you are transcending this subject-object differentiation, and you are no longer even having thoughts about your thinking. So no attributes, no subject-object differentiation, must lack self-knowledge, but it is the source of all things. So that is the one. And then, as I had mentioned, what you have going on here is the development of a theory of emanation, in which cosmology, which is about how everything is created, is ontology, which is about being. So everything is being, everything is alive, everything has conscience, everything is being. And in this process, which begins with the one loses nothing of itself in this process. It continues to be complete. And like I said, it does not have self-knowledge. And the metaphor that is used is of the sun and its rays. And this then gets picked up and carried through, pretty much everything I've ever seen in a kind of attempting to explain emanation. So it is the nature of the sun to shine and to give off rays. It is just its nature. That's its expression of itself. But the sun loses nothing by shining. It doesn't expend itself in this theory. So what happens then is that for some reason, which I had mentioned last time, but to go into it a little bit more, there is some mystery where the one has a thought about itself. It apprehends itself. So that's that moment in which it does have some self-knowledge. And that aspect that is having self-knowledge of the one is the next level of being. It's the nous. It's the mind of the divine. The one itself, as the object, remains complete and whole. So then at every level, once this happens, where, say, the nous is now contemplating the one, and in its contemplation is having thoughts, and those thoughts then are the next level of being. And again, the thoughts are alive, and they have being, and they have consciousness, and are then contemplating the nous. So at each level of being, it contemplates what's above, and by experiencing the self-knowledge, there is a split into the subject-object that emanates the next level. And like I said, in every level, the contemplation, the object of contemplation is untouched by the act or the being that is contemplating it. So it maintains its wholeness. So the general pattern in Plotinus is, first we have the one. And as I said, when it has this moment of self-knowledge, that's actually the nous that is now contemplating the one. The nous is the mind of God, many different translations there. And then from the nous, contemplating the one is having these thoughts, which is generating then the world soul. The world soul, which is it has more multiplicity, is the last of what we call the three hypostases. These are the beings who completely create through thought alone. Those are the three high divine beings in the philosophy of Plotinus. So the world soul in contemplating the nous is creating, basically is like the forms that are creating the manifold things, all of the different stuff. And then where all of the potency runs out is into inert matter, which we'll talk a little bit more about matter. But matter does not have consciousness. Matter is where everything kind of runs out. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But those first three, they're called the three hypostases, or sometimes the three real existent beings. Although officially, because the one is neither being nor non-being, it is the source, it is the void, it is all of those different things. The nous is really the first that's appropriately called being. And like I said, so you have the one, the nous, intellect, divine mind. It is multiplicity in unity. It is the all that is in the divine mind. It is the realm of the intelligibles, which is the Platonic ideal forms, and all divine thoughts are there. The third one, the all soul, that is more like unity and multiplicity. It is just coming over into almost what we would recognize as fully manifest. There are different levels of soul, but this level is the individual souls, but it also emanates individual souls, which is kind of an interesting thing. Basically, all things of the world are emanated from here. So the idea of like group soul, but also individual souls, and nature itself is a part of the world soul. Nature is understood here as the aspect of the world soul, which through its contemplation of nous, through its contemplation of the divine forms, links those forms to matter. And as I said, matter is the lowest emanation, and it's where everything then runs out. So matter, inert matter, just to go back through this, is essentially just the essence. I think of it as copier toner. It doesn't have any reality of itself. It's anything that we see or that we think about as being an object, a physical being, that's all a mix. It's a mix of matter and form that is linked through the aspect of the world soul that is nature, which is that part that allows that link. So matter then is completely indeterminate. It has no generative power at all. And as I said, it's just not, it's difficult sometimes when you're reading this, when you hit something about that's very negative about matter, and to realize they're not talking about the physical world. He's not down on the physical world like that. He's talking about, like I said, like the printer toner. And everything that we know of is the soul from the world soul shining into matter, which then gives it form. Like there's the ideal form, the archetypal form, but it's the link where the soul is shining into whatever it is, giving it some form. Everything comes from the one. So everything comes from the one and ultimately is part of the one. But yeah, so by the time we get down to matter, it's just like everything is run out. And it's just got, yeah, so it's its spiritual qualities, it's its mental qualities, it's the potency, like, there's no more from there to generate. Okay, so let's talk about evil here. So in this system then, evil is relative, it is not absolute. There's nothing that has essence that is like, this is what evil is, which I think kind of plays into this understanding of matter as well. Instead, evil is relative. So what we have in the system of kind of coming down and coming down and coming down, I like to think of it as there's distortion and copy degrade. Now, I don't know how many of you have done the old thing, because it's, older technology. If you took an old copier machine and you made a copy of something, and then you made a copy from that copy, and then you made a copy from that copy, and you keep doing that, or, more modern would be bit degrade, where, it's just kind of through this repetition of copying is beginning to distort and degrade on you. That's more what evil is like in this case. So a human soul then is composite. You have the part that is untouched, which is that immortal individuality. And then you have that part that is mixed with matter, which again, that's where all of that stuff has run out. So that's the transient personality. It's got soul shining through it, but it's now mixed with matter. And what happens is that the soul can get very confused and lost in sensation, and it begins identifying itself with a mixture and ceases being aware of, a lot of times, the part that is untouched, the part that is truly still part, clearly part of the transcendent, this unmixed. So again, we have this kind of distortion thing that can start happening. So in a lot of the Neoplatonic practices and in philosophy, there's this strong emphasis on purification or cleaning. Catharsis, by the way, the word catharsis, it means to cleanse. That's what it means. So there's a lot of emphasis on this kind of cleansing and purifying what doesn't belong to the soul. So trying to get clear and purify those accretions, the distortions, and not identifying with the part that is mixed, but becoming more clear on the part that is the unmixed, the immortal individuality. And some of the places that you see this most clearly has got two tractates that are called Against the Gnostics. There's a number of different Gnostic groups. There's actually quite a few. And you have some of them like the Manichaeists, they're more strongly influenced by Persian philosophy. And they're far more like there's a good God, there's a bad God, and they're at war kind of thing. But a lot of the Hellenic ones are a bit different than that. They're a bit more Platonic, but they also have a different theology. And in this, and I think I had mentioned last time, the very first Matrix movie is absolutely, I believe is Valentinian Gnosticism, is the one that I remember watching it. I was studying with one of the leading scholars in Gnosticism. I was like, oh my God, that's what it is when it came out. But the basic idea here is that the archons, which means leaders, but these spiritual leaders are kind of playing a role of a demiurge, are creating the world. They're creating manifest reality, but they're creating manifest reality in order to trap the light of Sophia, the light of the soul. And Plotinus is having none of this. Plotinus goes to the defense of the demiurge, which would be coming out of the nous. And he argues very, very strongly against this idea of dualism and against the idea of absolute or essential evil, and makes this case again. It's like, this is not that you have bad beings trying to do bad things. It's that you have this situation of, degrade and kind of confusion that then comes from that. And so Plotinus is arguing strongly to hold hope for the improvement, the restoration, the healing of all things. And in this way, even though there are times just like, I do not want, for the statue, like I don't want an image of an image, he's still very strongly saying the world is not bad. The world is actually good. The world comes from a good place. The world is good. What we have is distortion, and we need to cleanse that. We need to purify it in ourselves and in the world. So he's not world denying in that way, and he's certainly not embracing a very dualistic sense at all. So what he's then talking about is he's got a strong emphasis on what is essentially spiritual development. So the human soul and its telos. The telos, this is a Greek word, and it means its end. It can mean the death, but it also means its ultimate purpose. So there's many different things, and this is one of the words, a variation on this, that is used for the mysteries as well. So the soul then, a human soul, descends. You have the one, descends through the nous, through the world soul, into differentiation, and into this composite with matter. And the goal, the term, is sometimes another one that's translated, just so you know if you're reading it, or the telos, is to reascend into unity with the one. And that we do this through an unconscious compulsion. So I want to read this piece here. Certain people, we must keep in mind, have forgotten that to which from the beginning onwards their longing and effort are pointed. For all that exists, desires, and aspires towards the supreme by a compulsion of nature, as if all had received the oracle that without it they cannot be. So he's saying that we have this thing where ultimately we are from this source, we are part of this source, and we cannot exist without it. We are dependent. And that unconsciously, as a result of this, we have this longing, whether we recognize it or not, we have this longing to go back to unity. And so that is there. That is the ultimate kind of driving force, whether we recognize it or not. So the body and the faculties of the lower soul in this case, the personal soul, that would be that part that's mixed, the composite piece with matter, that these he understands as being like tools used by a carpenter is one of the metaphors that he uses. So the higher soul then, the part of us that is that immortal individuality, is gathering all of this information and is using it as food for higher thought in our ultimate ascent process. And again, I like that because it gives us some better sense of how to orient ourselves towards our full nature and how to recognize when we are in appropriate harmony that we need, and you'll see in some of the later, like in Iamblichus and Proclus, the part where us being embodied is spiritually important. So we're using this in order to learn and to grow even at the individual aspects, the level of the immortal individuality. So I want to talk a little bit about the human soul and epistemology. Epistemology is that branch of philosophy of how do we know what we know? So it's kind of that meta piece where we're trying to look at how do we know that we know. So again, you have the kind of external entity that exists, the lower soul, that personal soul is gathering information, and it's gathering information through perception. This is through our senses. And so whatever that is that we are encountering, we are taking in the information through our senses. And then whatever information is being taken in, it is classified by the reasoning aspect, by the part of us that is the part that can do logic and so forth. So that piece is neither sensory nor is it sensory correlative. And then beyond that, we have the higher soul, which then passes judgment on that data. So this is what we would call in Theosophy, I think this is part of the higher mind. So you have, stuff is coming in, is classified in a certain way by the lower mind. The higher mind is passing some judgment on the data. And then ultimately, it's the spiritual intuition, which in the Theosophical tradition, I would say is probably the buddhi. It's the part that is in the nous that turns one's attention to the part of the soul and the contemplation of the one. And that's the part where once we have all this data, then that's the part that has the recognition of what the truth of it is. After the higher soul, the higher mind has passed some judgment on it, then it can get used to move up into unity. So the spiritual intuition then is that's the part of us that is in the nous. And that is the part that has the highest ability to be veridical, to yield the true knowledge, to yield towards truth, because it's the part that comes from contemplation of the one. So part of what I also very much appreciate about Plotinus, and he's got one tractate in particular on beauty, but this is spread out among a number of them, is that he recognizes that there are different paths that are ways to ascend to the one that work with us in ways that deal with our personalities, that accommodate those, that there's just different paths for different people depending on what their proclivities are and what is drawing their soul. And again, if you think about it as we're doing that descent from the one into the nous then is looking up, it's seeing all of these different aspects of the one, which is creating the archetypes, and each of those archetypes then is going into and becoming part of like the soul, and then the soul is looking and that is creating. So what that means, and we'll see this more clearly in Iamblichus and Proclus in a couple of weeks, is that there's some differentiations, kind of some chains where there's different souls are kind of linked up through different pathways. So what he's saying there essentially is find what it is that you love. Find what it is that deeply moves you on this soul level, whatever that is. The beauty of the sensible realm, which is the realm of the manifest world, is a reflection of the beauty of the world soul. The beauty of the world soul is a reflection of the nous, and the beauty of the nous is a reflection of the one. So our souls tend to sing to beauty in sympathy with it. So again, sympathy in this case, to feel with, if you can imagine, this is sympathetic resonance, right? If you imagine a piano, you walk up, you hit the C, the middle C really hard, the other Cs are going to vibrate in the other octaves. The strings will vibrate in sympathetic resonance. And so our souls are singing in beauty, in sympathy with it, because our souls are beautiful. And our souls ultimately come from the three hypostases. So, and among those, one of the main characters is beauty. So there's beauty that then is the source of the beautiful, which is the source of all the things that we find beautiful. So if something moves us, be it music, art of particular types, whatever it is, find that and use it, what's calling to your heart. So he gives us this path where understanding the temperament and using the love of the many becomes then the quest for the source of the beautiful things. And that is part of what can lead us on this ascent. So again, I have a couple of them here. One of them, if you get into this particular one, and I gave you the information on your sheet, I'm just going to read it, but he goes through each of them, the musician, the lover, the metaphysician. And I've just used the first here of the musician as an example. Essentially, there's the musician. By the time you get to the metaphysician, these are the people who are really, really into like math and science and things like that. It's like, use that, which is quite different than the musician, but I'll just go through here. So the first degree is the conversion from the lower life. The second, held by those that have already made their way to the sphere of the intelligibles, have set it, as it were, as a footprint, but must still advance within that realm. Last, until they reach the extreme hold of the place, the term attained when the topmost peak of the intellectual realm is won. So the intelligibles, what he's talking about there, that is the nous. So these are people that have made it up to the nous, but they still have to kind of explore the nous. They're not yet ready for the one. But the highest degree must bide its time. Let us first try to speak of the initial process of conversion. We must begin by distinguishing three types. Let us take the musician first and indicate his temperamental equipment for the task. The musician we may think of as being exceedingly quick to beauty, drawn in a very rapture to it. Somewhat slow to stir of his own impulse, he answers at once to the outer stimulus. As the timid are sensitive to noise, so he to the tones and the beauty they convey. All that offends against unison or harmony in melodies or rhythms repels him. He longs for measure and shapely pattern. The natural tendency must be made the starting point to such a man. He must be drawn by the tone, the rhythm, and design in things of sense. He must learn to distinguish the material forms from the authentic existent. So that's its transcendent form, the archetype, which is the source of all these correspondences and of the entire reasoned scheme in the work of art. He must be led to beauty that manifests itself through these forms. He must be shown that what ravished him was no other than the harmony of the intellectual world, the nous, and the beauty in that sphere, not some one shape of beauty, but the all beauty, the absolute beauty. And the truths of philosophy must be implanted in him to lead him to faith in that which unknowing he possesses within himself. So it's finding that thing that is calling to you, in this case, the musician, and then learning everything you can, immersing yourself in that which is so beautiful, and then trying to use that to rise up into the planes, to the source of that. Another one, these lovers then, lovers of beauty outside of sense, must be made to declare themselves. What do you feel in presence of the grace you discern in actions, in manners, in sound morality, in all the works and fruits of virtue, in the beauty of the souls. When you see that you yourselves are beautiful within, what do you feel? So he's calling on you to take that part, that feeling nature. What is this Dionysiac exaltation that thrills through your being? This straining upwards of all your soul, this longing to break away from the body and live sunken within the veritable self. So again, the ecstasies, to stand outside oneself. There are no others than the emotions of souls under the spell of love. And finally, he gives us an image in which we are to take all of this, and then we are to think of ourselves like a sculptor, chipping away all that is not of the higher, the transcendent. But how are you to see into a virtuous soul and know its loveliness? Withdraw into yourself and look. So it's very introverted. You go in and do contemplation. And if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful. He cuts away here, he smooths there, he makes this line lighter, the other purer, until a lovely face has grown upon his work. So that harkens back again to this notion where we're both using beauty, we're using this looking inside ourselves, seeing what it is that is calling, because we always have this inherent desire for the one, which is ultimately you go to that through yourself. But also this notion of the purification that we saw earlier when we're talking about the problems of evil and so forth, where it's this distortion. So chip away anything that is out of alignment, that is not in alignment, and using that deep sense of the emotional draw towards beauty and love and these higher things as the guide for what it is that we need to purify. There's a lot of different emphasis, as I have mentioned, on various forms of purification. And of course, we also have in the Neoplatonic curriculum, you're also studying Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics, all of this emphasis on virtue, which is also about all of this. But we are then also learning how to cease with this dominant identification with the body, because the body, again, is part of the composite being in which the soul is mixed with matter. And part of the big danger is we get confused and think that that is us. So suppose the soul to have attained, the highest has come to her, or rather revealed its presence. She has turned away from all about her and made herself apt, beautiful to the utmost, brought into likeness with the divine. By preparing and adorning which come unbidden to those growing ready for the vision, she has seen that presence suddenly manifesting in her, within her, for there is nothing between. Here is no longer a duality, but a two in one. For so long as the presence holds, all distinction fades. Again, that's like no attributes. It is as lover and beloved here in a copy of that unison, long to blend. The soul has now no further awareness of being in body and will give himself no foreign name, not man, not living being, not being at all. Any observation of such things falls away. So part of this is working on not identifying with the body. And then as we are going through these various mystical experiences, that begins to fall away in experience. As with all forms of contemplation, you are turning inwards. This is a fully turning inwards. The way to the divine is that you are already you're already the divine. You just have to go in and find that part and leave behind all that is not that. So it's removing dualities, always looking for where the dualities are and removing them. And then contemplating the ideals, which is what a large part of Platonic study is about, is trying to understand and then experience the ideals, which are, up in the nous, and therefore identification with the nous. And so once you are able to climb back up, what you do at that point, once you have contemplated the nous and you are in the mind of God, is when you become passive and wait. Because that's where all striving will now get in the way. So as you can see, it is the opposite of the descent down, the descent into creation. So you go from the world, the manifold world of things, and then you are striving to find what is that which is behind, that is making things beautiful or what have you. And from there up into, and then what is beauty? And once you're able to find yourself in that aspect of contemplation, then you go quiet and you wait. And that's the basic form. So there are really two different theologies that are pretty common. And in the Greek, it's apophasis and kataphasis. So apophasis is the apophatic discourse. Via negativa is what it's called in the Latin. And that is, again, this removing of duality, where you're just removing anything where you see the duality, you're removing it. And then the cataphatic discourse is the positive theology. And actually, I guess you can say either one can be used. That Neoplatonism tends to use a lot of apophatic discourse, and that was different. They also, though, do use cataphatic. Like I would say, identifying with what is the beauty in all things, and then going up through beauty, what is beauty itself, and then going, that's more cataphatic. But the removing all dualism, like what is this duality that I am encountering? What are the things that are not my soul? It's not that, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. So that's more the via negativa way. What is it that is clouding the divine and getting rid of it? So they have both. But like I said, I don't know, the via negativa or the apophatic was not, I don't think that was really used before Platonic and Neoplatonic. So a few minutes here to go into some additional influences. Some of the impact of Plotinus. As I had mentioned, he's the one who first brings together this synthesis of Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism, blending it with this strong mysticism. And from Plotinus on out then, soteriology is emphasized. So soteriology is the branch of philosophy and religion, theology, that is emphasizing salvation. So after Plotinus, you really have this strong emphasis on philosophy as a pathway towards personal, individualized salvation. So again, some of this is coming out of the mystery religion kind of emphasis, because mystery religions tend to have a strong soteriological content. But that becomes particularly dominant, and some of the other things, looking at some things that we would now look at more as science are de-emphasized. The importance of contemplation, so this kind of contemplation that is very meditative as a method of spiritual development, is emphasized strongly. And again, this is different. It's there in a certain way, but not as strongly. So there's study and there's various things that we know that philosophy was going to be doing, but a lot of the practices were not as clearly spiritual forms of meditation. It's not as clear that was there as strongly prior to Neoplatonism. After that, after Plotinus, it is definitely there. It is definitely clear that what we're aiming for here is this kind of spiritual development, and what we're doing, contemplation and meditation, is a part of it. Plotinus, his philosophy is absolutely transcendent. He is very, very careful to keep the one as whole and therefore not having self-knowledge, and is ultimately transcendent. But he argues strongly against other forces that were present at his time that were more world denying or demonizing the world. He is definitely opposed that. This, like I said, the two tractates on against the Gnostics. He is not world denying. He is not demonizing. The world is not evil. The physical world it may have distortions as relative evil, but it's not inherently, essentially evil. And then this idea of emanation, which we spent some time on, this becomes absolutely key in all later Western esoteric traditions that I know of. I think this idea of emanating from the source, and that all of these different steps down that are also linked, so that we have these different aspects of self as well, that is essential for later Western esotericism. So after Plotinus, so Plotinus dies, and Porphyry carries on his own work, and Porphyry appears like his main student, carries on his own work, and he edits and organizes and publishes the Enneads, which is why we have them, because otherwise they would have just been tractates that have been floating around within his senior students. Iamblichus, who we'll study next time, elaborates on emanation and introduces theurgy. And theurgy is what we would call, you could call it spiritual alchemy, you could call it higher magic, meant for evolutionary purposes and so forth. But that's what Iamblichus then is going to introduce into the mix. Now, the Alexandrian Neoplatonists reject Iamblichus. They decide that they don't want theurgy for a variety of reasons, and they try to return to more of a Platonian understanding. They also reject some of the elaborations on emanation that Iamblichus brings to the picture.